Join us now in today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Good morning. I'm Bryn Douglas, pastor of Simpson United Methodist Church, and your host for today's Austin Faith Dialogue. This religious public affairs program is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries and K2BC. The focus for this dialogue is mission, global mission. One of the means through which the gospel is spread in Brazil is mass communication, specifically radio. Brazil has a population of approximately 140 million people, a mixture of races and culture, but the one common language is Portuguese. In Brazil, competition for the individual's attention is as keen as anywhere else. Propagandists are selling everything from soap to whatever on the air 24 hours a day, blaring forth their message and inciting the people to buy, to join, or stand still. Christianity must be presented just as powerfully and attractively to the total population. Our guests today have been missionaries to Brazil for a number of years and have now retired and live in Austin, Texas. Join me as I welcome Reverend Curtis Goodson and his wife, commissioned missionary Elsa Goodson, who are with us today. Reverend Goodson has served in radio and audiovisual in Campinas, Brazil, directly involved in spreading the message of Christ by means of mass communication. Mrs. Goodson has been a director for elementary education. She's also worked with Spanish-speaking people in Brooklyn, New York, in a community church. Later, she returned to Brazil to work in Christian education and Christian literature. She has also co-edited a quarterly entitled The Builder. That's the English translation. We're delighted to have you with us today, and surely after a long tenure in Brazil, you must be happy to be back in the United States. I understand that you both were sponsored by the Presbyterian Church of the United States, and I just wish could you share to us how that happened and your experience with that sponsorship.
Well, of course, it really goes back a long ways, because as a young person in high school, I felt like the Lord was calling me to Brazil to be a missionary and to work in Christian radio. And it must have been true, because that's the way it turned out. But because of that, I studied electrical engineering and then went to seminary and then was a pastor for a year in North Carolina and then went to Brazil.
Yeah. Quite talented there.
Well, not really. I got to Brazil and found that most of my missions work was in areas that didn't even have electricity, much less radio stations. But the Lord doesn't make mistakes, and after about a year of what they call itinerant missionary work, where you travel from place to place and preach to small groups and distribute tracts and teach and things like that, then I was invited to join the Christian Audiovisual Center called CAVE, C-A-V-E,
yes,
in São Paulo in Campinas, Brazil, and that's in the southeast part of the country.
That acronym really stands for what, those letters?
The Evangelical Audiovisual Center, or
yes,
the Christian Audiovisual Center.
Good. Mrs. Goodson, and how did you become missionary for Brazil?
Well, after becoming a Christian, because for a while I didn't believe in anything or go to any church, but at 19 I was converted in a little Presbyterian church in Falfurrias, south of here, about 250 miles. And after being there for a while, the Lord opened the door for me to go back into school. I had been a dropout for about 5 years. Went back to school and finished my high school work in a Christian school in Taft, Texas. Then went on to the school in Durant, Oklahoma, southeastern state, but lived in a Presbyterian college. And the teachers there were very much interested in missions, and they helped me and several other people to become interested in missions. Then I was sent to Mexico because I had a scholarship to study there in a mission school. And there I really felt that the Lord was calling me to work in Brazil, even though I liked Mexico very much. But while there, I had to write a paper on one of the mission countries in which the Presbyterian Church had work. And I chose to write about Brazil for some reason and got interested in Brazil from then on.
God does work in mysterious ways, but they all work together for good. Reverend Goodson, you had the gifts and graces of your pastorate. Did you have opportunity to share that while you were in Brazil?
Well, yes. Of course, most of my work in Brazil was on the technical side of things because of my engineering background and my feeling of my particular calling to the radio ministry. But my first year in Brazil, I was in what they call itinerant evangelistic work, and then my latter years were mostly spent in teaching, where I worked at the University of Mackenzie, which is a Presbyterian university started over 100 years ago by missionaries through the gift of a fellow in New York named Mackenzie that left a sum of money in his will to establish a university for engineering in Brazil.
That's interesting. And you worked for the Light for the Way recording studio there.
Yes, well, first, after the first year in Brazil, I went to work with the Evangelical Audiovisual Center, the CAVI. And this was an interdenominational effort supported by the Methodists and the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and most of the other groups, even the Seventh-day Adventists were partial supporters of it. And we produced anything in the audiovisual line that could be helpful to the churches. Radio programs, yes. TV programs we never got into. This was back in the 60s. But we did produce some motion picture films. We produced over 100 film strips for educational purposes, Christian education, and records, phonograph records, and anything in the non-projected line also, such as the flip chart, flannel graph, blackboards, things of that nature are also part of our products. But then in the beginning of the 70s, the Audiovisual Center was forced to close for lack of support. So shortly thereafter, I moved into the more teaching type of ministry and into the work with the Presbyterian radio program, which had just begun.
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. Mrs. Goodson, you worked with primary education as a director,
yes,
and some teaching. Can you share with us?
When I first went there to Brazil in 1951, I was the first Mexican-American to go with the Presbyterian Church U.S. as a missionary, and I was sent first to study Portuguese. Even though Spanish, which is my first language, is very similar to Portuguese, there are enough differences that they felt it was necessary for me, that is a mission boy, for me to study at least a whole year like the rest of the missionaries. And then they sent me to an area in Mato Grosso, Dourados, which at that time was just beginning to develop as a state. It became a state then, but the government was giving land grants. 100 families a day were coming into that city of 16,000 and making it grow. And I worked for 4 years in Dourados, Mato Grosso, with elementary school children. 75 of the 300 children that I had in my school were Japanese children who were coming with their parents also to get the land grants that were being offered by the government. So I had a wonderful time with those children.
So not only did you work, though, and you were there long enough to see some of, I guess, the fruit of your labor with students.
Yes. After I returned there, I was there just those 4 years, but in 1975, I returned there to visit with some of the children that I had left when they were young, in their young teens, and I was able to visit especially with some who had become doctors and nurses and teachers, and it was very interesting to see their progress and how much the city itself had grown in those 18 years that I was away. So it was quite, I had one Japanese student who had become a doctor, And he came up to me and said, do you remember when I was in the 2nd grade and you wanted to take a little mat that I had made? Everybody had handwork in those days, even the boys. And he'd done this little, what we call a cattail rug or something, rag rug. And I wanted to take it to the States to show people what some of the children had done. He says, no, my mother wouldn't let me. So you remember that? I said, yes, I remember. Now here you are, a doctor.
Oh, that must have been very rewarding.
Very rewarding. He was working in a Christian hospital there in Dorados.
You have some books there in your lap.
Well, this is after I went back the 2nd time. In 1975, I went back as a volunteer to work in another section of the Brazil, in the northeast section, in Recife, a city of 2 million people. And I helped in Christian education and in producing books, helping young Christian writers to develop their talent. This is, for instance, this is a book on different celebrations of the church. The church on their feast days is what this would be, and so it's programs for the different ecclesiastical calendars, programs. And this is a book that I translated with the help of my husband and several other people. 2 Brazilians helped me with this. Donald Griggs' book, Teaching Teachers to Teach. It's for Christian education. Then this book is Overcoming Difficulties. And this was in 1979 that several people got together and wrote a chapter about how they overcame difficulties in their lives, different types of difficulties, not just handicaps, physical handicaps, but some spiritual handicaps too. I wrote about how I overcame my spiritual anemia.
All right.
To read my Bible every day. That was a year I learned to read my. This is Decisive Moments, a 3rd volume. It's stories, 8 or 9 pages long. Each writer would tell his story. And Juraci Fialho Viana, one of our Brazilian writers who worked with the mission a long time, edited all these stories, and then the book was printed by our mission. And several other books were printed, but I enjoyed working, especially with these.
Yeah, so that's quite a credit to you, you know, to have had that contribution. And that you can see it now, you know, and enjoy it. And while she was doing that, what were you doing?
Well, I was working with the Light for the Way, the Presbyterian radio program, which really started as a very small thing, mostly broadcast over the Trans World Radio in the Caribbean, back to Brazil at about 5:30 in the morning.
Oh.
But people would get up in the northern area of Brazil and awaken their neighbors by turning up the radio real loud to hear the program. And then later on,
that was mass communication, wasn't it?
Yes, and you heard it whether you wanted to or
yes,
not.
Yes.
But later on, they decided it was more practical to broadcast over the local Brazilian stations. And with this, the ministry of the radio program blossomed forth. Perhaps I should mention that the man who is head of the radio program, the Reverend Celcino Gama, Brazilian, was one of my first students at the seminary when I began teaching there. And my course at the seminary was Techniques of Communication. Well, he mastered the course and went on to do a course in communication at the university also.
Well, it seems like in Brazil, like everywhere else, you really have to be deliberate in getting the gospel, you know, spread. And that's what has happened with, you know, the help of you and other missionaries that have been so committed, because there's so many other things that's being communicated, you know, as well.
Well, the religious views in Brazil, or there are various religions that they have in Brazil, are so vast. Everything from the lowest form of spiritism to Christianity itself, of course, which we consider the highest, but especially Presbyterian. But but you have a wide gamma of religions there. In fact, one of the most interesting experiences I had while working at the Audiovisual Center was helping a group from the Episcopal Church produce a film for the United States about religions in Brazil. And one of our experiences was to record a Brazilian macumba, or spiritism session. And yeah, everything went very well until I accidentally knocked over the meter and shorted out the wires and blew the fuses, and the whole thing stopped until we got the fuses changed again. But it shows you, well, describe what it was. It looked like a dance, but the orchestra consisted of 4 drums. People would dance until they got themselves into a trance. And then they would be escorted into one of the back rooms, one of the changing rooms, and in their trance they would select a costume and put it on and come back out and do a solo dance in that costume. This is a description without any religious overtones of what was going on. But supposedly they were possessed by some spirit at that time.
So you had competition was keen.
Yes, very much so.
I know that you both completed your ministry together, but as I understand, you didn't begin your mission work together. And I just, having talked with you previously, think it's exciting how the Lord really does work all things excitingly together for good. And if you share with us how when you went over there, how you met, and maybe how long it was before you saw each other again, and here you are today.
Yes.
Well, I can start because I went first. I went in 1951, and he didn't get there till 1954, and that's when we met. But then I was already working way out in the sticks in Mato Grosso, and he was studying in Campinas, so we just went our separate ways at that time. He found someone else, and then I continued working, and at the end of 56, I returned to the States for a year, but I met someone in Peru and got married 7 months later, and the Lord moved me from Mato Grosso to New York City, actually, and that's when I work in Brooklyn with the Spanish-speaking people. And he continued his work in Campinas, and very happily married. And I continued my work for 17 years. I was very happily married and living in New York City. Then my husband passed away in 1974. And the Lord called me to go back to Brazil precisely to work in the two, in Christian literature and in Christian education, because I had prepared for that. While I was in New York, I was able to go to school in those two fields, so I was able to return and do that kind of work, teaching in a seminary and also helping in the Christian literature work of the mission.
And when she returned to Brazil in 1975, she traveled around to visit various of her friends. She came through Campinas, and I saw her for about 2 minutes. I said, "Hello, Elisa, welcome back to Brazil." And that was that. That was the last time I saw her until I proposed to her.
Oh, my.
Well, what happened for me was that, of course, I got married the same year she did, 1957, to a wonderful Brazilian girl who had been my language school teacher, and we had 27 wonderful years together, and then the Lord took her to be with him.
Yes.
And at first I didn't know what was going on, what the Lord wanted me to do after that, and I thought maybe I was getting kind of touched in the head with my bereavement. Well, anyway, what happened was, from the funeral, one of the missionaries went up to Recife and took the news with him up there that my first wife had died. Well, the group there had been praying for my wife during her illness. And so when they heard that she had died, they sat down, or Lisa sat down and wrote a letter of condolences. It was the first letter I received in condolences, and I put it there beside my computer thinking, well, when I feel better, I'll write a thank you note. And each day a few more letters would come in, and I would put them all there by my computer. But I always kept them in order, the first in, first out type of operation. Well, every time I would come home from work at the University of Mackenzie, I would see that stack of letters, and there was this letter from Elisa there on top. And for some reason, I began to think about this lady whom I had not seen in 10 years, and who I had not dated in, what would it be, 30 years?
How many, 30?
And there was no reason in the world for me to even think about her. But I couldn't imagine why I would even remember the things we did together 30 years ago. I thought I really was becoming a little bit, off. Anyway, after a few months, I decided I should get these thank you letters written, so I sat down by the computer and composed a letter, which was really pretty long. It was about 4.5 pages, because most of these folks had never heard from me or I from them in 10 years or more. So I told how my first wife had become sick and died, and told how I was ready for retirement, and yet after retirement there were still these jobs to do and things of that nature. And then in the letter to her, I also told ask her what she was planning to do because I knew she was retiring. And you write a letter on a computer, then it's in the memory of the computer. All you have to do is change a few lines and send the same letter to everybody else.
That's what you plan to do.
That's what I planned to do. I never got around to doing it, though.
I thought the letter was only for me.
I sent the letter to her on a Monday and thought, well, she probably won't even answer the letter because you don't answer a thank you note to a condolence note.
But most thank you letters are 4.5 pages long.
Right.
Okay.
But anyway, so I sat there all week long wondering, will she answer or won't she answer? No, she won't answer. Yes, she will. Well, why should she? Like I say, I began to think I was really getting a little bit off. And came Saturday, the mailman had not brought any answer. I found out later there's a mail strike on. The mailmen were on strike. But anyway, it came Sunday, I remember sort of, I wouldn't call it praying, but sort of complaining to the Lord that if it's really in His will that something should come of my thinking of her, then it would be real nice if she would telephone me. Well, she didn't telephone me.
Until Monday night.
Anyway, it came Monday morning. The postman didn't bring me anything. And yet, so I thought, well, okay, let's get on the ball and get back on the track and forget about it. Came Monday evening, and I got a long-distance call from this voice that I didn't even recognize, asking me a technical question. How do you get mildew off a film strip? Well, that doesn't surprise me. People from around Brazil have called me about various technical things because they know I'll try to give them an honest answer. And one fellow called me from out there in Mato Grosso in the west of Brazil about what computer should he buy. Well, anyway, and the fellows at the Christian radio stations quite frequently called for technical help in trying to fix some problem or other. But I asked her who was calling, and it was her.
See, your answer.
Well, yes and no. She asked me if I had gotten her letters. And I said no, and we talked a little bit, and she said she had sent me a book and 2 letters, and also that it would be real interesting if we did get together at a Christian conference that was coming up, a missionary conference. So we decided that would be fun, and we hung up. Next morning, the post office got on the ball and brought me the letters. And the first letter was just about what I could expect. It really was what they call a missionary correspondence letter about what she'd been doing the past year, and then on the back side she scribbled a little bit about what she planned to do after retirement, go back to Texas here and retire.
You have anything you want to say about that? Is that's the way it really happened? Our time is moving on.
Tell her about the prayer, though.
And I had prayed. I had wanted a second husband for about 3 or 4 years, but I read a book that suggested that if we put down everything we wanted God to answer, specifically, that perhaps He would hear. And it seems that it worked for me. I wrote down the type of husband, second husband, that the Lord was going to give me. Mm-hmm. And among some of the things I said, someone who was retired, someone who was about my age, someone who was had about the same education that I did, and things that would make us compatible and so on. So I decided, well, why not include that prayer, since He asked specifically, what do you intend to do when you finish your work? I said, well, among other things, I intend to get married. Here's the type of person that the Lord is going to send me. So
well,
he picks up the phone and proposes immediately.
When I opened the second letter, I would be, pretty self-satisfied if I thought I fulfilled all the requirements that she had in that list. But when I compared the letter with what I had written to her, there was no doubt that the Lord was in this. I mean, one of the first items, she wanted a person who was retired. My letter to her began this way: by the time you get this letter, I'll be retired. She wanted a person who liked to read. I said, after I retire, I have such and such jobs before me to do, but it really would be nice just to sit and read a good book. And I do love to read. And she wanted a person who'd like to write. Well, I don't really like to write, but well, my letter to her was 4.5 pages long, so she thinks I do.
Well, anyway, we see God in there working all things together.
There's just one thing after another.
And yes.
So that evening, I picked up the telephone and called her, and I asked her if she was standing or sitting down, because I figured this might come as a bit of a shock. After reading the letter and of her prayer and comparing it with mine, I felt the only thing to do was to propose to her.
Well, and you did.
And so I did, and she accepted.
We're going to have to continue this. Our time is out for today, and we thank you both for being with us today. We are still struggling to fulfill the Great Commission that Jesus has given to us to go into all the world and make disciples of all people and teach them to observe all things that Jesus has commanded. And we have reminded that he will be with us always. And for that we say, to God be the glory.
For more information about today's topic, call the Austin Area Conference of Churches at 472-7627.